It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the organization team of the Digital Classicist Berlin. And it's also my pleasure to welcome our first presenters, Chris Forstall and Lavinia Milić. Just a short introduction for those who are new here for this series. So it's our fourth time we organize this series every winter semester. And we are a group of digital humanities researchers. We have different kinds of preferences in our research, and that's why there's such a mix of digital humanities topics inside this program for this winter semester. That's why every evening there will another chair here in front of you and give a little introduction into the topic for the students a quarter before 5. So I also welcome the new students. So we all opened this series this time, the second time for students as well. And we are very happy to have about 10 students this year. So thank you very much also, and welcome the students and everybody here in the audience for the first talk in the Digital Classicist series this term. So second time, welcome the new presenters, the first presenters of our series.
Okay, thank you to the organizer and for you to be here. Let's introduce ourselves. This is Chris Forstall. He has a PhD in classics, and his dissertation was about oral formulaic composition in the Iliad. And he took also part in the Tesseract project as a lead programmer. I'm Lavinia Milić. I have a PhD in classics too, and my dissertation was on the most famous poet in the world, Deutsches, a late Latin poet. We are currently involved in a research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation and led by Damian Nilis at the University of Geneva. Damian Nilis regrets not to be there with us today. And this project aims at measuring the complexities of the intertextuality in classical poetry, with a focus on Latin epic poetry of the Flavian period, that is the 1st century CE. Today we are going to present you a work in progress devoted to attempt at identifying all the larger thematic context of word-level text reuse. Our presentation should last about 30 minutes, and we will be happy to answer to your question at the end of the presentation. It's nowadays widely recognized, since the works of Genette, Conte, Barchiesi, Heinz, Wills, amongst others, that the phenomenon of intertextuality is particularly relevant for classics. And by intertextuality, I mean the relationship between two or more texts as a fundamental element of the whole process of literary creation and communication. So, discovering meaningful allusions from a text to another is a major issue of commentators and critics' tasks. But this relation between texts can't be assessed simply at a verbal level. Text reuse involves other levels of similarities, such as the structure of the poem, the theme employed, imagery, typical scenes, and so forth. For instance, when in Book 1 of the Aeneid, we have Aeneas who is beautified by Venus, you can be sure that he was thinking to another scene of another epic poet, Homer, in the 6 books of Odyssey, when the eponymous hero was beautified by Athena when he was meeting Nausicaa. In the field of digital humanities, researchers as David Bauman, Marco Büchler, Gregory Crane, Neil Coffey, and others have already pointed out the need to move beyond the words, to catch and understand every component of text reuse. Yet, in fact, the digital tools already available to the classic researchers allow them to find mainly verbal connection. You can, for example, make a Boolean research in open access databases like Musisque Deoque, Packard Humanities Institut, or in websites that are available by subscription like BTL and Brepolis. Musisque Deoque and Tesserae offer a different approach because the research is to be done by choosing one or more texts and not by selecting words beforehand. The first one, Musisque Deoque, allows to compare one text to many, and Tesserae allows to compare two texts in which we can find the two same words. And now I let Chris continue to present Tesserae.
Thanks. And so we'll just look a little bit more closely at Tesserae. It was because of my work at Tesserae that I was invited to join the research group at Geneva. But as Lavinia pointed out, its principal search is based on phrase identity, on finding at least two words in common between our two phrases. So it's a kind of text reuse search. There are some experimental feature sets available on Tesserae, or that will soon be available, that try to go beyond just phrase identity, but nothing has really been well integrated into a word-based search yet. And so online right now, as of about last week, there is a search that attempts to look for semantically related lemmata in addition to just the dictionary head word for an inflected form. It's a work in progress. If anyone wants to go online, try it out right now. They're sort of beta testing it. They'd love to hear feedback about how it works and how it doesn't work. We've also attempted to go sort of above and below the word level of granularity with character level n-grams in an attempt to capture sound similarity independent of what the word is. And there's an experimental search that's not even available from the front page. It's a separate section of the website, but that tries to look at paragraph level relatedness using topic modeling. And it's that approach that we're going to try and work with again here. So we're going to present two test cases, and the second one is not quite as far along as we imagined it might be when we first submitted our proposal, but never mind. You can tell us how to finish it. The first case was an examination of Statius's Allusive that took place in the context of a master's seminar in Geneva. So it was an exciting opportunity for us to incorporate digital humanities into the classroom, and we can make a few notes about that briefly. But in general, our goal was to say, can we discover the thematic context for specific allusions, and is that then useful in our interpretation of the allusion when we go back to close reading? If the answers are yes, then we hope to eventually bring that thematic level feature set to support the current word-based search in Tesserae. So these are some of the general questions we asked. How does Statius deploy allusions to epic versus to elegiac sources? So when we're talking about thematic context, we started really big, a binary separation of just two important genres. So about as coarse-grained as you can imagine here, to try and make it an easier problem to solve. And so we used commentaries that cited allusions to an epic corpus and to an elegiac corpus, and we said, how are these being used in Statius's text? Is the tone of the source text, is the fact that these words are drawn from an elegiac source important when we read them in their new context within the Allusive? Does Statius's work itself contain epic and elegiac parts? This was one of our working hypotheses, which we later rejected, the idea that this late or later epic was a kind of mélange of different themes, of different genres. Is it a heterogeneous work? And then finally, if we can find epic and elegiac passages within the later text, and we're talking about distinct corpora in the source texts of elegiac and epic sources, what's the relationship between the tone of the new work, the tone of the earlier work, when we're looking at a specific allusion? Does it matter that we're alluding to an elegiac work in an elegiac portion of our newer text? Is it more interesting when we're alluding to something that is thematically contrastive rather than congruent? Those were the questions we hope to get to. A really brief note about the pedagogical aspect. We had 8 master students in this seminar, and we tried to give them a mixture of traditional translation tasks, exegesis, and then working with digital tools in another part of the class. They did a lot of work at data collection as well, and this image represents some of the evaluations we received at the end of the course. But all in all, it seemed to be really valuable. We began each session with a 15-minute summary of what we had achieved so far, what kinds of analytical processes were enabled by the data collection and the working with digital tools. And at least one of the master students then went on to say they wanted to use similar techniques in their doctoral research. Was that right, doctors? Yeah. If you want to follow along, we kept, or actually this is really belated, I'm still updating things from last year, but you can follow along on the blog under the Geneva Acculated class. So this was our first attempt. It was a kind of toy model. We had a very small corpus, and we used whole texts as our samples. So we just said, at a really gross level of granularity, can we tell the epics from the elegies? We have Ovid dominating the elegiac corpus. We also include him in the epic corpus, and we can get a sense of the difference between an authorship signal and a genre signal, as you'll see in the next slide. We're going through step by step sort of primer on stylometry in the class. So we started with looking at just, say, 2 words. What is the frequency of arma versus amor? And we plotted them on a grid. And then we ramped that up. We looked at Zipfian curves, and we said, okay, let's take 21,000 word frequencies and used principal components analysis to visualize them in a sort of easy to digest format. Here's what we got. We have the 3 sort of more orthodox epics, for want of a better term, right on top of each other at the right-hand side of the graph. We have the elegies over to the left-hand side of the graph, and Ovid's Metamorphoses is right in the middle. And so we get a sense of authorship, genre, and on top of that, a sense that Ovid is a really incredible author, I think. He's got a lot of diversity to his writing. The x-axis, the first principal component, does all the work of separating the 2 genres, and the y-axis seems to be completely devoted to Ovid's diversity. So then we tried to make things a little more interesting. We enlarged the corpus, we narrowed down our feature set, and we took away the top-ranked words so that we could try to attenuate that authorship signal. Once again, we used principal components analysis to simplify this multidimensional feature set, and we looked at small samples, 50 consecutive verse lines. Now, for a lot of stylometric tasks, this is a tiny sample, but in part, we're trying to get away from traditional questions such as authorship and look at heterogeneity within the text. So it's partly motivated by necessity, that we know that these thematic segments are about paragraph level, and we can't avoid that. At the same time, going smaller allows us to see a sort of the variability that authorship studies traditionally want to get rid of. For the same reason we're looking at consecutive lines, we're not randomizing, as, for example, Maciej Eder would tell you to do. Here are the results. The green's a little washed out. It's Ovid. So the red samples represent epic texts, the black represent elegy, and the green is Ovid in the middle. It's the same lesson that we saw in the toy model, but with a little bit more precision. We can get a sense of the heterogeneity of these works and of the genres. Ovid manages to overlap the the other two genres, but he still has a center of gravity between them, which is kind of exciting. The metamorphoses, I mean. If we take him away for the moment, once again, the x-axis does a great job of discriminating the two genres. If you just draw a vertical line on the first principal component, you can, this is, I think, minus 1.4 or something arbitrary, but it gives you 98% correct classification. Out of all of those samples, there are about 19 that aren't on their own side of the line, which is really incredible. Here is the Allusive. So at this point, we've been able to refute our original tentative hypothesis that this was some kind of mixture of genres. We can say clearly, in as much as we can tell the difference between these two genres with our classifier, he's on, the Allusive is on the epic side. Moreover, when we look at Ovid's metamorphoses, we get a clear idea of what a mixture would look like in this model. And so we can say pretty certainly that this is not what we imagined at the beginning. But we weren't quite satisfied. We had a sense that because we were making these uniform samples of 50 lines, and we were looking at things that were on the order of that size, it would be very easy to kind of accidentally cut a scene boundary right in the middle, average it out, and somehow lose the purity of that thematic signal. And so we redid this part of the experiment using the scenes as demarcated in one of our commentaries, the commentary of Ripoll-Soubiran. So we now have non-uniformly sized samples, but we know they correspond to a human being's sense of where the scene boundaries are. We recounted the frequencies and then projected those new samples onto the feature space that we had already defined using the corpus as a whole. And that looks like this. There are a couple of take-home points. One is that there seems to be a slight increase in the amount of variance there. So this thought that maybe if we go with the human identified scenes, we get a bit of a purer signal and thus a greater difference between the scenes seems kind of true. Also, a few of them fall on the other side of the line now, which is exciting. And so the next question is, having abstracted all of this out of word frequencies, how do we go back to a close reading? Is this meaningful to us as readers? Although in general, this is not what we would call a mixture, this is clearly on the epic side, there's still a relative difference in all the samples, right? Some are more elegiac than others. Does that mean something? How does this correspond with our sense of the narrative? This is what you get if you just take the first principal component and then plot it with those scenes as defined by Ripoll and Soubiran. It's a little bit hard for you to read, but there's another version of it on our blog if you want to go and look at it there, or we can share the slides later. It's also rotated so that you can read it better. But from a certain distance, it does seem to correspond with our gut instinct. It will require more close reading to really put this to the test. But the highest points, I can't point with this presenter mode, huh? Oh, I can. So the highest points here and over here are where we see the muster of the Greeks at Aulis, where we see the fleet, and where Thetis observes the fleet going past. Also here we have the first appearance of the character of Achilles himself. We talk about his heroic pastimes. On the other hand, the low points, with the exception of this, and I'll mention it briefly in a second, but the low points tend to come either when there's dialogue, when there are women in the story, and most importantly, when women are speaking, especially when women are complaining. And so the three lowest points here, here, and here correspond to women expressing concern for Achilles. Lamenting his fate or being worried about his going off to war. The lowest point, though, is the exordium, the 12 lines of introduction. And to be honest, this seems to be an anomaly. We're going to have to examine what's going on there and figure out why it behaves this way. But aside from that, everything corresponds roughly to what one might expect. And that leads us to a couple of more questions then. If it seems to be doing what we expect, then does it actually help us when we're reading? Does it add meaning to our reading of specific allusions? So does that improve our reading somehow? Does that add meaning to our interpretation? And if so, can we use it to bump those tesserae scores, which right now are ranking specific verbal correspondences according simply to whether the words are rare or whether they're close together? Can we add this as a support to that if we find it meaningful? And so to look at those questions a little bit more deeply, I'm going to give you Lavinia back to examine a couple of passages.
Yeah, so let me try to answer to this question with an example. I will take as example the last part of the first book of Achilles, where we have the Deidamia's lament, because Achilles will go to Troy in final. The scene has indeed a strong elegiac color, as Giampiero Rosati has already pointed out. And these elegiac colors, the passage have these elegiac colors because we find in it a specific vocabulary, maritus, dulcia furta, flere, and so on. There is too a iunctura, occupare artus, with a new meaning. In epic vocabulary, normally this iunctura is used to express an emotion, a negative emotion who is seizing someone. And here it's used to say that we want to embrace someone, so hold the body of someone. The princess is represented as a relicta, an abandoned woman. She's scared by the fact that her lover has to face the danger of the sea. She's jealous of potential rivals, and she's begging a promise of coming back. The commentators have detected verbal and thematic connection of this passage with, first, elegiac poems. For example, Propertius 4:3 or 2 of the Herodies of Ovid. The text of Propertius is a lament of Arethusa to Lycota, who is leaving to war. And the 6th Heroides is Hypsipyle, who is writing to Jason. And the 13 is particularly important because we have Laodamia, who is writing to Protesilas, the first hero and the first dead hero of the Trojan War. Commentators have found verbal and thematic intertextuality too, but with elegiac erotic section in epic poems. For example, Catullus 64, where we have the lament of Ariana, or Georgic 4, Aeneid 4, the Dido book, and so on. Which brings to me to our concern: does the metric we have shown you before, can it be used to improve tesserae scores? Our goal is precisely to detect automatically the context of a poem, because it's important for allusion, to modify the rankings of verbal correspondences detected by tesserae. And I'll take only 2 examples. The first connection was found by commentators too, and the second we could found with tesserae. As the 2 matching words aren't particularly rare, we have pronouns, ilius, we have a preposition, ante, we have ipsis, that is intensive adjective. The parallels obtain a score 7 in a tesserae, but is not so high. This means that before reading this significant intertext, these significant allusions, the researcher has to read 3,120 passages in the worst case, or in the best case, 2,781 passages. And I'm sure that he will give up reading before arriving here. So, a ranking that could take into account the fact that this verbal reuse is probably more meaningful than another, because the 2 contexts are similar, would be welcome. And this could be combined too with detection of the metrical position. You see in the first example, ilius ante oculos, it's in the first part of the lines. and undis, unda in the clausula, and combined with the detection of synonyms. In the first example, we have fructus and undas that could be catched. The Buffalo team, as Chris said before, is already testing the detection of synonyms, but there is still work to be done. So it seems clear that elegiac intertext enrich our understanding of the Achilleid and deserve a larger consideration. Nevertheless, our results show that allusion is a complicated matter. We can't simply identify elegiac parts of a poem by comparing the number of phrases borrowed from elegy or borrowed from epic. Verbal text reuse is only a component of the color elegiacus of this poem. Allusion to epic poetry are in fact predominant through the whole work, as you can see in this slide. Here the graph is illustrating the number of parallels borrowed from epic, this one, the white one, and the parallels borrowed from elegy. And as you saw, there are more parallels from epics. But anyway, there's a bias here because only one commentator of the four, René Uccellini, was specifically concerned about elegiac allusion in the Achilleid. To conclude on this first test case, we can say that our hypothesis of classification, this binary classification, elegy versus epic, is reasonably straightforward. And at coarse scale, thematic metric supports our intuition and can be used to support close reading, even if we have to admit that the relationship between verbal allusions and context is not a simple one, but we know already. We knew already. Let's move on to the second test case. Here we raise the question of the relationship between Apollonius, Virgil, and Valerius Flaccus. Apollonius and Virgil are the main model of Valerius Flaccus' Argonautica. As you know, epic genre is conservative, formally conservative. So we can assume that epic poems are supposed to be structured in type scenes, similarly to the ancestor of this genre, Iliad and Odyssey. We can define a type scene as a recurrent block of narrative with identifiable structure, to use the word of Mark Edwards. Here you can see his categories of these type scenes: battle, social intercourse, travel, ritual, speeches, and deliberation, with subcategories too. And these categories are recognizable in the three epic poems we are focusing on, particularly at the midpoint of each of these texts, that is Apollonio 3, Virgil 7, and Valerius Flaccus Book 5, because these three epic poems are different in length. But we are in the middle of each of these poems. The similarity of the respective scenes at this specific place of the poem suggests to the reader that Valerius is competing with tradition, and it's a marvelous passage to measure the process of adaptation, transformation, reappropriation by Valerius of epic material, in order to tell the same story in a different way or a different story. Our ambition is first to obtain automatic detection of this kind of thematic similarity, and second, to combine it to a verbal digital research. And now I leave Chris continue.
So the last part of our presentation may be a little bit shorter, but essentially, as Lavinia said, we're going to see whether we can find similarity in theme now between two epics and use the fact that they have a similar context to perhaps reread or give a different priority to the verbal allusions we find in those places. This presents a lot of challenges compared with the first much simpler task that we set ourselves. We need a feature set to detect this perhaps large range of themes within a genre, which means that the differences may be smaller. For example, we don't have a metrical difference supporting the two classes. At the same time, we don't just have a binary distinction any longer. We have an unknown number of classes that we are trying to distinguish. And this is unfortunately a case where the authorship problem once again rears its head. It's going to be really hard to distinguish the heterogeneity of these poems from the difference between them in terms of authorial style. But our hypothesis is that all these guys are drawing from some kind of repertory of themes, and that those themes are drawing on similar vocabularies. So in theory, starting from term frequencies, we should be able to realize these guys are, okay, we're tapping into this cluster here. We haven't got there yet, but you will help us during the question period. So this was the corpus that we began with. Since we were considering Valerius Flaccus's Argonautica, we had a big corpus of epics, and then we threw into the mix two other works that we felt might be thematically similar, especially because our group has a particular fondness for Medea. And so Ovid's heroines and Seneca's play there might very well have something to say to this. At the same time, if they appear way on the fringes, we'll know that we're really looking at an epic phenomenon. I grayed out a couple of things here because we're not going to have so much time today. But once again, we start with a set of term frequencies, and then we did tf-idf weighting. I had made a promise at one point that we were going to do all of this using R's topic modeling packages, and so that motivated some of these choices. But we do tf-idf weighting on our frequencies, and then we tried LDA as well with 50 topics. In all these cases, what we then did, I mean, the different step here from the first time around is that we applied unsupervised classification to the resulting feature set. And we said to the computer, can you find us distinct classes here with varying values of k? We used even smaller samples, which was debatable, but that's what we did. Here's an example. It's a little bit tricky to see on the screen, I'm afraid, but this is an example of how authorship really affects this feature set. This is the plain tf-idf scores, and you can see just by the colors represent true authorship, at least in combination with the symbol shapes. And you can see that there is a nucleus of works in the middle that all land on top of one another, but around the periphery there's this halo of authors who have really distinct works that have really distinctive styles. Including Ovid. This, you can't see it on the screen because it's colored by author, but essentially this is the Metamorphoses closer to the center, and farther out on the periphery is the Heroides. So genre did play a role there. Lucan is down at the bottom here. This one was Corippus. This is Silius Italicus. But Virgil, Statius, Valerius Flaccus, and a couple others are right here in the middle on top of one another, which gives us some hope. This is what happens when we do LDA. A lot more of the authors are starting to converge in the middle, but Ovid is, if anything, farther out. And once again, in particular, the Heroides are really distant. Here is one example of the k-means classification then. We did it with 7 classes here. We'd gone from 2 to 12 for our value of k. And then we do like 10 repetitions and see how well the classifications agreed with one another, looking for local maxima in the stability of the system. That's something that we're interested in hearing more about. If you guys know how to pick the optimal number of classes, that'd be something we're really interested in. But this is an example with 7, which was a local maximum. And what we find is that some of the classes are wholly devoted to particular authors, and in Ovid's case, to particular works. So the blue and the black classes over here, this is overlaid over the same principal components that we saw with the tf-idf scores, but the colors now show classification. And the Heroides is black, and the Metamorphoses is blue. So 2 whole classes were devoted to Ovid, one for each of his works in the corpus. Lucan basically gets his own class, more or less. down here, and Charybdis more or less gets his own class, which you can't see on the screen. The remaining three, the pink, orange, and red here, were more or less fairly divvied up by the remaining authors, which gave us some hope that there was a certain degree of variance across the corpus, but partaken of by all of the authors involved, or some of the key authors involved at any rate. Although the red one is sort of dominated, the periphery of the red is dominated by Silius Italicus. Here are just Virgil and Valerius Flaccus. Remember that in the beginning we saw that they were kind of at the closest to the center, and they were more overlaid than some of the others. And that's what you see here. Unfortunately, they have similar initials. So F stands for Valerius Flaccus and V for Virgil. But you can see that there are Fs and Vs at this side of the graph and at this side, top and bottom. So we're not seeing a separation by author, at least not an obvious one. At the same time, each of the two authors has at least one or two samples in, say, 5 of the 7 classes, 4 or 5 of the 7 classes. And so this is getting closer to what we were interested in. And we're only at the beginning of this work, but I can show you our first close reading, or our approach to close reading, was with Virgil 7, or Aeneid 7, which you saw in the chart at the beginning of this section. And what do we have? It's a little bit difficult to interpret and should be taken with a grain of salt. This is a result of the LDA feature set, and at the same time that LDA is more decoupled from authorship, it's also much less stable, and so whether this is going to be the same the next time you run it is a little bit dubious. But what we found was that it roughly divides the work in half, for one thing. So the second half of the poem, Book 7, falls into this red class, more or less. The first half we find in the other two of the generic epic genres, the ones partaken of by multiple authors. 2 samples in this book belong to classes that were basically dominated by one author or another. This is Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is the class dominated by Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is the class dominated by Lucan's Civil War. And our tentative reading for now is that it's true the work does, this book sort of begins with a peaceful half and ends with the preparations for war. And so the fact that the red classification, the red cluster, is one where you see a lot of Silius Italicus makes us think that perhaps we are at a certain granularity approaching something like a thematic marker. This single sample here may stand out in part because the beginning of the sample happens by coincidence to fall right at the beginning of a scene. At the same time, it's the Ovid Metamorphoses class, and it's an angry woman speaking, and so we may see the same kind of effect we saw in the other analysis. We're going to have to dig deeper and find out. This happens to be the only actual battle in the whole book, and it falls into the Lucanian class. Perhaps this is a coincidence, but as I say, it gives us hope that we're on the right track. The next step for us here is a closer reading. You don't need to look at this specifically, but essentially this is as if before. Then we go to the commentary, we take the human divisions of the scenes, and we started putting them into classes of our own so that we can compare how well the automatic classification does. I'd like to make mention right now, we sort of did some hand waving at the beginning about other groups that were doing similar work, and Memorata Poetis was mentioned. I think Federico Boschetti is in charge of this project right now. And they're doing something similar with epigram, but they're starting from the hand classification. So one of our goals is to meet them in the middle. And where we'd like to go from this is towards supervised classification. I think that one of the reasons we were more successful in the beginning, besides having a simpler task, was that we started by training it on hand-picked corpora. We said, these are the texts that have some kind of similarity we're interested in, so are these, show us the difference. We built our classifier to distinguish those two corpora. And if we start perhaps from the other side here, hand-pick the themes we're interested in, and then try to distinguish them using a classifier, we'll have finer-grained success. So I want to wrap it up really quickly with a thank you to the students who participated, who did the monkey work. Also to our partners in Buffalo and elsewhere on the software side of things. this is how you can get in touch with us. And if you're interested, there's the Tesserae website there. You can try the tool out. As I said, they're beta testing their latest version, so try everything out. When things break, email them. Neil Coffey is the leader of that project. And now we'd be excited to hear your questions and suggestions. Thanks very much.